This year, almost 2 million Americans will be diagnosed with cancer. And while there has been much success in both prevention and treatment of cancer, there is still much work to be done. Tonight's commencement speaker leads an organization that is front and center in the fight to cure cancer. He is also a world-renowned physician-scientist who has served as an outstanding scientific leader of organizations and is one of the most influential scientific voices in the world. There can be no greater advocate for the missions of education, research, and patient care than this evening's speakers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Harold Varmus.
Thank you very much. First, lest we forget, congratulations to all of the students who are graduating today, to their families who supported them, and to this magnificent faculty at your school that's helped you on your way. Let's have a round of applause for all of them. The second point is a caveat. Until an hour ago, I thought I was speaking only to medical school graduates. I welcome having PhDs in the audience, and I hope they will get something from this. I will allude to some things that are specially crafted for them, but this is a talk to the medical students principally, and contrast to what you see, it's not about cancer, it's not about research. So last week I was casting about for a topic for this talk. I tried to calm myself down by asking a colleague if he could remember the talk at his medical school graduation. And to my dismay, he beamed and said, "Of course." It was Alan Alda, who played the doctor in MASH. The pressure is on. As my wife would say, you don't do humor, at least not well. So instead, I'm going to spend my few minutes hoping to make a lasting impression by talking about a potentially overlooked aspect of the new status of those who've just married their way into medicine. Now, I need first to acknowledge the obvious significance of this moment of matrimony and transition. You, the medical students, are on your way to being fully vetted physicians, holding a degree, if not yet a license, that will allow you to assume one of life's greatest responsibilities, the capacity to care for someone who is ill. It will also have occurred to some of you, perhaps most of you, that your place in the world is changing in a more practical way. As you move from medical student to trainee, you are also changing from someone who pays to someone who is paid. And that also means for many of you that you are moving from someone who has been accumulating debt to someone who is now starting to pay it off, albeit slowly. And congratulations for that, too. I'm sorry you have that debt, believe me. But this is our country. So today I want to emphasize a more subtle and perhaps a more important point. When you, the medical school graduates, place those two letters, an M and a D, after your name, you will hereafter be labeled as a person with special knowledge and, here's the big word, authority. And I want to explore that idea in greater depth in just a moment. But first, let me tell you something that I learned from a similar, even an analogous event last year. And here, I'm specifically speaking about PhD graduates. So I was asked to speak last year at the graduation of the first class at the newly formed graduate school at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, a school which I have to immodestly admit I helped to found. Now, I told these students that they were not just getting a PhD and a ticket to become a professional scientist. They were also becoming gatekeepers. Gatekeepers, people who bear the responsibility for bringing others into the gates of science. And that means identifying, encouraging, and instructing the talented young people who will become scientists in the future and helping them to become good scientists. And in that talk, I talked about my own mentorship at the NIH by a revered scientist still active at the bench named Ira Paston, who brought me as a sort of itinerant literary physician, jack of all trades, into laboratory life. But today I want to make a slightly different case about the receipt of a medical degree, namely that you are getting more than a degree and more than an entry into a notable, even a noble profession. You will be given respect and the mantle of authority. Why this authority? I see at least two reasons. First, you are now officially recognized as knowledgeable about human biology and disease, about the many ways in which life's functions, physiological, genetic, molecular, behavioral, can go wrong. And you were given the knowledge about what science has taught us about making things right. And thus you will be seen as an expert on one of humanity's most important and valued topics, health. Second reason for this new mantle of authority is that you will be viewed as someone who cares enough about the well-being of others to have worked hard for the past 4 years, and I warn you, for the years to come. And you have pledged, you will pledge tonight, to use that knowledge for the benefit of others. So here I'm going to introduce a larger dimension to this, because if you exercise your knowledge in the best possible ways and for the best possible purposes, you will be thinking about much more than the individual patients who seek your guidance and seek your help. In doing this, you will also be attentive to the health of the public, to the health of those who are now well, not just those who have become ill. And most critically, for the message I'm going to deliver today, you'll be attentive to the many aspects of our complex society and to the environment in which we live that affect the state of our health. And it is on this last point, your attention to the state of our society and to the state of the environment in which we survive, that the respect and the authority vested in you by the degree you're receiving tonight may be the most valued and the most needed. Your views and your actions can and should extend well beyond the immediacy of medical practice, and even beyond the precepts of preventive medicine, to those difficult places where medical knowledge and social policy intersect, to those places where public policies affect the health of our neighbors, and even, I hate to admit, the future of our species. Now, before I tell you more about these intersections and what they may mean to you, allow me a moment of confession. So, this notion of a physician's authority to improve the world did not affect my own decision to enter medical school or any of my choices about a career path after finishing it. I decided to go to medical school for much more selfish reasons. I decided while I was a graduate student studying English literature, heading for a life as a teacher of literature, because I left that program because I was attracted to a different idea, the idea of flexibility. I read that Gertrude Stein, the well-known author and noted art collector, who had first attended medical school because she was told that medicine can open all doors. It created flexibility, and I hoped it would do the same thing for me. Now, the story of my own changing interests, from journalism and literary criticism during college, to psychiatry and clinical medicine while at medical school, and then to basic medical research at the NIH, is a story for another time. But I've always been glad to have the flexibility that the MD degree provides to conduct research, to teach, to run institutions, even to work in the federal government and to be involved in politics. Still, flexibility is a self-indulgent trait. It's been good for me, but it now seems less significant than the authority that's conferred upon you and the ability to use that authority to benefit others. So let's move to the main event. What are those uses to which you can apply your new authority, respect for good social purposes? And let me acknowledge at the outset that there are many examples of MDs who use their degree and its implied authority to make irresponsible pronouncements. I see their names frequently in bookstores with their MDs emblazoned on the covers of self-help books that opine about diet plans, exercise programs, and paths to inner peace. So let's simply agree from now on that we're speaking only about using authority in a responsible fashion. Now, before we think about what you should do with your authority, let's look at some earlier examples of MDs who have strongly influenced public policies by speaking authoritatively as physicians about the consequence of public policies for health. Let's start with a big one. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, abbreviated IPPNW, we'll use IPP, was founded in 1980 by a coalition of US and Soviet doctors. The US contingent was led by Dr. Bernard Lown, an immigrant from Lithuania trained in the US, who also invented the cardiac defibrillator and is still active in his Boston practice in his early 90s. Now, together with his colleagues from the US, the Soviet Union, and ultimately over 60 other countries, Dr. Lown based his opposition to nuclear warfare on the direct observation of experience in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and on the precept that physicians have a responsibility to try to prevent what they cannot treat, in this case, the horrendous consequences of mass irradiation. In the notable words of one former prime minister, the group, and I quote, made medical reality a part of political reality. So for its work in 1985, 5 years after its founding, the IPP received the Nobel Peace Prize. The citation from the Nobel Committee noted that the IPP's service to mankind was based on, again I quote, its spreading authoritative information and creating an awareness of the catastrophic consequences of atomic warfare. Now, the IPP certainly raised awareness. It's difficult to measure its impact directly because, as many of you will remember, the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, dissipating the most tangible threat of nuclear war. But its message is still relevant today, as we hear of nuclear threats from Iran and North Korea and other places. Moreover, the IPP inspired similar efforts by physicians to highlight the medical consequences of conflict. For example, Physicians Against Landmines has drawn widespread attention to the medical dangers posed by those mines, the largest source of war-related disability on Earth, and has helped achieve passage of many international laws that ban anti-personnel mines. So I'm going to talk about a couple of personal examples in which authority can be displayed, and I want to emphasize here the way in which, even at my advanced age, I can be educated to those examples. So I am someone who's headed federal agencies for 2 presidents, and I've come to know how medical institutions and the people who run them can affect public policy. But I'm still learning the breadth of issues that I can use my authority as a physician and cancer scientist to address. And Robert Hormats, who's an Undersecretary of State, has recently given me 2 very useful lessons about this. Now, one of Bob Hormat's areas of responsibility at the State Department is conservation, especially the conservation of species. And over the past few months, he's asked me to write short statements on 2 topics that rarely cross my desk at the National Cancer Institute: the murder of rhinoceroses and the loss of species diversity. Some of you may know that powder made from the rhinoceros horn is prized not just for its alleged sexual powers, but also as a claimed cancer therapy. And Hormats asked me to write a blog entry, something I'd never done before, about this. So I provided my views about wounding these remarkable animals to obtain medically worthless, extremely expensive materials, leaving behind a dying animal that belongs to a species now threatened with extinction. This first effort as a blogger was picked up by a few hundred magazines, to my surprise. So Hormats then asked me to co-author a short essay with him that described one of the consequences of unregulated development and overharvesting of timber, namely how the loss of plant species, species that historically have yielded some of the most useful drugs that you've all recently learned about, aspirin, digitalis, quinine, colchicine, artemisinin, and many others, and how the loss of those species could limit access to drugs not yet discovered. So thanks to Hormats, I now see this as a very good use of my authority to address problems that are not in my daily field of view, and I think all of you should think in similar ways. So what kind of issues can I recommend for your consideration for use of your new authorities? Let me mention a few and then concentrate briefly on one. And each of them is a topic in which medical doctors in particular have some special expertise, but I believe to be inadequately addressed by physicians and their organizations in the current debates that we're all experiencing. The first issue is gun control. Yes, Mother, I know I'm in Texas. The ubiquity of guns in this country is a critical factor in our relatively high rates of gun-related mortality and morbidity. Annually, about 30,000 deaths in the U.S. are attributable to guns. The press and the public, in their debates, speak mostly about the 10,000 homicides, especially the mass shootings that have occurred recently. But as emphasized a couple of months ago in the New York Times, we say less about the other 20,000 deaths, which are mostly suicides and some accidents. We also say relatively little about the many severe wounds, including frequent spinal paralysis, that result from guns. Now, I know there are at least two sides to these discussions, and I know that the ubiquity of guns does not fully explain all of this damage. Further, the improvements that regulations and new laws might bring are not easily achievable, as our Congress and many state legislatures have proven recently. But I'd like to hear more from MDs, using their authority to describe the effects of guns on public health, not just murders, but also suicides, accidents, and severe injuries. And any of you who've lived through, as I have, the death of a colleague who in a moment of depression, was returned to his apartment where a weapon for hunting was left in his closet and then leading to his suicide, will know the feeling that one has about this delicate and difficult topic. A second topic is the nation's uneven performance in science and math education, especially in the first 12 years, 13 years of education. If we want to improve the ability of our citizens to adapt to the rapid changes in medical science that are occurring now, we need more than just the medical training and the medical research that's done here in an exemplary way at Baylor. We need a population that's taught to learn, to appreciate, and to evaluate the evidence that will increasingly serve as a basis for healthy living and good medical practice. But I don't hear many medical voices in the debate over education. A third topic concerns the potentially devastating consequences for health that are implicit in many of the environmental issues that are now quite openly discussed. We are free in talking about how the climate is changing, the rising demands for and the shortages of clean energy in countries both rich and poor. We talk frequently about the continued and unsustainable growth of the human population and the loss of species diversity. But while we often talk about the rising carbon dioxide levels and global temperatures, about alternative energy sources and about legislation and treaties that never seem to get passed, I don't hear much, especially from physicians, about their implications for health and for the future of our species. So where are the authoritative medical voices that are noting the effects of rising ocean levels on people living in lowland habitats? The voices that are pointing out that warming will produce a resurgence of insect vectors for malaria, dengue, and other infectious diseases. And where are the medics who should be warning how crowding and hunger and water shortages will predispose our species to violence and other social maladies? On all of these topics, regardless of what policy changes are recommended, physicians have critically important perspectives to bring to the debates, but I don't hear our voices often enough amidst the general din. But as of today, you graduates are going to have the authority to make reasoned statements that will be heard, listened to, and respected. And I hope and expect to hear from you soon. One final topic, and I've saved this important topic to the end because it's the one that will most immediately affect the way you practice medicine with your new degree. I know there are divergent views of the Affordable Care Act, but virtually everyone in the U.S. is concerned about the rising costs of health care. And if we don't do a better job to control costs, our entire economy, not just our entitlement programs, will be further jeopardized. Many solutions have been proposed. One that I find especially provocative would not only affect you, it would require your direct participation. This proposal was made about a year and a half ago in the New York Review of Books by another Harvard physician, Arnold, called Bud Relman, who, like Bernard Lawn, is operating in high gear as he enters his 90s. Relman also speaks with an unusually high level of authority. For many years, he was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, in his article, Relman laments the inexorable rise of medical costs, the fee-for-service structure of our healthcare system that encourages those costs, and the impossibility that our gridlocked partisan Congress would ever pass the kind of legislation that might move us in a much better direction. But he's not a pessimist. He takes comfort in the idea that medical care might be reformed, and indeed, he argues, is already being reformed by the many physicians who are entering multidisciplinary group practices that pay salaries and charge patients and charge enrollees on the basis of their participation, not charge them for each service. In other words, patient capitation. He writes that nearly 200,000 doctors in this country, nearly one-fourth of the practicing physicians here, are probably now using such practices and participating in such practices, that the numbers are increasing swiftly. These multidimensional group practices are popular with newly minted doctors, like you, because they don't have to incur more debt to start their own practices, because working schedules are inherently flexible, because the groups are collegial and stimulating, and because the care is sound and the cost to patients are well controlled. Continued movement in this direction, he argues, might ultimately drive the legislative changes that would presumably be required to bring about a full transformation of our system. And for these reasons, his article was entitled, "How Doctors Could Rescue Healthcare." Now, my point about this is not whether Bud Relman is right or wrong, although I happen to favor the kinds of changes he seeks. I hold up his thoughtful article as the kind of contributions that physicians should be making to the political, economic, social, and environmental problems that we are beset with. And I point to Relman's authority as a physician and editor to encourage you to believe that the new authority you are receiving today will allow your voices to be heard. Now, I too am an optimist, and I know from interactions with medical students across the country that your generation of medical students is more engaged with such social and political issues than mine was. And I see this most frequently in the domain of public health and in global health. And I, as a result, am confident that you will use your new authority wisely. You will have earned the respect that you will now receive. So congratulations again for a job well done, and thanks for listening to my plea.